Hi.
Hello again. We wanted to address the issue that although both the Watchtower and the churches create dependence in their own ways, they have the opposite problems.
Mm-hmm.
The problem in the Watchtower is the problem of all cultic groups. Problem in the churches is dynamically and socially the opposite tendency. Mm-hmm. But they all play out with systems of dependence that are not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So let's read, to set up the discussion, Proverbs 2, 1-5.
Okay. My son, if you will receive my sayings and treasure up my own commands with yourself, so as to pay attention to wisdom with your ear, and that you may incline your heart to discernment, if moreover you call out for understanding itself, and you give forth your voice for discernment itself, if you keep seeking for it as for silver, and as for hid treasures you keep searching for it, in that case you will understand the fear of Jehovah, and you will find the very knowledge of God.
So Proverbs is pretty clear how we get wisdom. The whole book of Proverbs is devoted to this theme. How we develop fear of Jehovah, the Lord, Yahweh, and how we find the very knowledge of God.
Yeah.
But why does this have to be said?
Yeah.
I guess is what we have to visit culturally and contextually. Why did Proverbs have to say this? Because we're assuming this was written.
I think because we're all lazy, and we tend
the
to
human
want,
condition.
want
the human
to do
condition, yeah.
the least we can to get away with. That's what we want.
So how did that play out in Israel around the year 900 when we think Solomon had to write these words down? Well, if you know anything about the temple and the tabernacle before it, or the period of the judges before the temple was built, you realize the religion was pretty much like it was in all the other pagan nations. People did a certain ritual.
Yeah, you get used to a certain form or ritual, and then you somehow connote the ritual itself, the fact that you're doing it, with you being spiritual. And being wise and knowing the truth.
So even after the synagogue became real for the Jewish religion after the exile, when teaching actually became far more in depth and far more in breadth than it had before, bringing together the canon, even so, by Jesus' day, the days of the apostles, Jesus still had to say to a man who came and said, "How can I have eternal life?" And Jesus still had to say to them, "Well, what does the law say?" And then the man makes the usual negative claim that by obeying the law and doing the rituals of temple worship, as all Jews were taught by their system at that time, somehow that guarantees your relationship with God. Jesus cuts through all of that legalist tendency in Judaism and says, no, the whole law can be summed up in 2 commandments.
Yeah. Love God with your whole heart, mind, soul,
and strength.
And love your neighbor
as yourself. So why would he have to say that to Jews who, well, that's in Leviticus. That idea is in the Torah, in the center of it.
Yeah, because I think what happens is that you start to think that by doing a certain routine, a certain ritual, that you've made it. But, the counsel or the criticism that you hear from all the prophets is the same. They were not actually practicing what they knew. They could say it, and that happens today. You can say the truth, but you don't always practice it.
So religion, as exercised by the human heart, whether pagan or Jewish, is always going in the direction of what kind of a deal can I make with God so that I don't have to love him with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's what religion does, and we all have to be aware of that. Even as ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, we have to be aware of it. Yeah. How can I make a minimal deal a contract deal with God?
Yeah.
And Yet this book of Proverbs plainly says that's not going to cut it with God. To find the very knowledge of God, you have to be a diligent seeker. And Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, does he not say the same thing?
So when we talked about, at the beginning, you were talking about the problem of Watchtower people and the problem of church people are similar. There's a dependency, but we might want to talk about the differences. They both have the same problem, really, or opposite problem. They both have dependency, but they have opposite problems as to how that plays out. So
well, in the Watchtower, it tends to be that you've got this hard or concrete ceiling that nobody gets past. So
as far as your learning level, right?
Your competence as a teacher. Well, the guys at the top in the Watchtower, like in most cults, don't know much better than the average Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah,
and they're not scholars.
Yeah, that's demonstrated by now having these public broadcasts. You realize they don't strike you as any more learned, any more depth than the average witness.
You rise in the Watchtower by your loyalty to the org.
Yes.
So the guys at the top don't know that much more than the rest.
But with the way the org is set up, everyone is obligated to be a teacher. And that's different in the church.
Absolutely.
In the church, not everyone is obligated to be a teacher.
No pressure.
Yeah, so then what happens is if you're not pressured, you just don't do it. Right? So they rely, their dependency is on their teachers.
Pastors.
To teach them. Yeah, their pastors to teach them. And for them to get the information that is very available to Christians.
Because at the top in the churches, in the older churches anyway, you have this incredible array of scholars who are not from one or two denominations, they're from all denominations.
And
men that have
respected.
outstanding teaching, and they're respected across, you might say, trans-denominationally. But the problem is the knowledge that's up there in those teachers rarely gets down to the lay people.
Yeah.
Pastors often, depending on the pastor, will access that level of scholarship.
Information, yeah. But to the average Christian does not feel the necessity. They're dependent on whoever is their pastor to give them that information. But there's a danger in that, even just as far as you're not going to be as competent in explaining your faith, in dialoguing with other people, or in being able to articulate what you believe.
So you give the unbeliever the excuse for thinking Christians are shallow.
Yeah.
Because we often are.
And then there's the danger for your own children.
Yeah.
If you can't articulate your faith, when your kids get to a certain age, when they're not thinking anything you say is right, when they get old enough to be thinking things through, if you can't explain to them why you believe what you believe, they too think, well, it's shallow, it's not real, and then they may fall away.
And of course, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you know how that plays out for you. You go door to door and you find people who know less about the Bible than you do, which makes you think you know the Bible.
Yeah.
And you very rarely run into pastors and almost never run into scholars. Yeah. So you get the idea that somehow the Watchtower's teaching you in a better way than Christians. Well, it is often true, but
wrong comparison.
but it's not healthy in the way it plays out. The Christian therefore confirms to the cultist that somehow he's better off and is getting fed better.
Yeah. So we need to be seeking, reading, learning, and talking.
And accessing the teachers that God has given the church. So obviously we have Hebrews, and the teacher who wrote Proverbs, probably Solomon, who was not a prophet, and is not even claiming to be inspired, just like Luke. And then there's the teachers in the church, and I just wanted to highlight three guys who wrote on Hebrews, actually, who did wonderful expositions and or commentaries on Hebrews back in the day when Russell was building the Watchtower, what were the teachers of Christendom doing? Well, two Hebrew Christians, that is, Christians converted from Judaism, were writing commentaries on Hebrews. So teachers, outstanding teachers that Christ had given the church in the days of Charles Russell, the late Victorian era, were exploring the writings of another teacher, the anonymous writer of Hebrews, which book stands on its own merits as far as these men are concerned. This is Franz Delitzsch, who you may be familiar with, wrote the famous Kyle Delitzsch commentary on the Old Testament, but also wrote on the New Testament. That's what scholars could do in those days. So on the Greek text of the book of Hebrews, Franz Delitzsch is one of the Hebrew Christian commentators. That was 1857, by the way, when Charles Russell was a tyke. And Adel Sefer, 1872, when Charles Russell was a teenager, another Jewish Christian who wrote also 2 volumes on the Epistle to the Hebrews. And then someone all of us will have heard of, if we're Jehovah's Witnesses, B.F. Westcott, who is partly responsible for the text we use for the New World Translation. 1889, Westcott put this commentary out on the Greek text of Hebrews the same year as Charles Russell published his famous The Time Is at Hand. So while Russell and his followers were concentrating on times and seasons, the great teachers of Christendom were concentrating on the deep things of God revealed in the book of Hebrews, which we'll want to talk about in a future video, because Hebrews concentrates on this very dependence we're talking about.
Okay.
And how Jewish Christians particularly, were falling back into Judaism and that system of dependence. Rituals, yeah. I think in a subsequent segment we want to see how this tendency to dependency played out in one of the last books of the New Testament, the first epistle of John.
Yes. Okay.